Back in the winter of 1885, the world felt vast and indifferent, particularly out where the land stretched thin and the sky seemed too large for just one man. Thomas Benton knew that feeling intimately. His small cabin, huddled against the biting wind on a lonely ridge, was less a home and more a defiant thumb pressed against the indifferent scale of the prairie. He was a man carved from the same harsh wood as the land, weathered, solitary, and holding on to existence with a quiet, stubborn grip. He was 28, but the sun and wind had etched lines around his eyes that suggested more years wrestled from the earth. Handsome, folks in the few scattered settlements grudgingly allowed, but handsome in a way that spoke of solitude, like a mountain peak seen only from afar. He had come here 2 years ago, after the fever took his wife and unborn child within a week of each other. The town, with its pitying glances and well-meaning but hollow words, had become unbearable. He sold what little they had, bought this remote claim, and set about the arduous task of building a life out of rock and dust. It wasn't much of a life. Wake before dawn, chores in the biting cold or the oppressive heat, mend fences the wind tore down, haul water from the creek that threatened to freeze solid come deepest winter, tend the few head of scrawny cattle that somehow survived the elements and the wolves, eat alone, the silence of the cabin, a constant, heavy presence, sleep, only for the routine to begin again. It was a life defined by hard work and the absence of sound, broken only by the lowing of cattle, the howl of the wind, and the occasional crack of his rifle when a coyote got too bold. Loneliness was a physical ache, a dull, constant pressure behind his ribs. It wasn't just the lack of another person, it was the lack of purpose beyond mere survival, the absence of shared laughter, shared worry, shared silence that wasn't empty. He carried his grief like a stone in his gut, heavy and unyielding. He rarely went into town, maybe once a month for supplies, enduring the stares and the strained conversations. He was the man who had lost everything, the one who ran away to bury himself on the edge of nowhere. And he let them think it, because maybe it was true. His hands were rough, scarred by rope and wood. His face was usually shadowed by the brim of his hat, his eyes squinting against the sun or downcast against the wind. He spoke little, even to himself. The cabin was sparse, clean but bare, reflecting the man who lived there, functional, stripped down to the essentials, no room for softness or unnecessary comfort. A narrow cot, a rough-hewn table and chair, a small stove, a few shelves holding dented tins of beans and flour. The only hint of another time was a small, tarnished silver locket he kept tucked beneath his shirt, pressed against his skin. He had built walls around himself, thick and sturdy as the logs of his cabin. Walls against the past, against pity, against any flicker of hope or vulnerability that might let the pain back in. He existed, he survived, he endured, but he didn't live, not in the way that mattered. He was a ghost haunting his own life, the vast prairie swallowing his lonely echo. This was his stasis, his self-imposed prison, carved out of grief and the unforgiving landscape. It was late afternoon when he found her. He had been tracking a stray calf near the western edge of his claim, where the land sloped down into a shallow canyon choked with scrub oak and juniper. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of distant rain. He spotted the calf near a cluster of gnarled ancient trees, and then he saw her. Tied to one of the sturdiest oaks, arms bound above her head, ankles lashed together at the base of the trunk. A woman. His heart hammered against his ribs, a sudden, unfamiliar panic flooding him. Who would do this, out here? He approached cautiously, rifle held loosely in his hand, scanning the brush for any sign of movement. Silence, save for the rising wind that whipped her dark hair around her face. As he got closer, he saw she was Navajo. Her traditional dress, usually vibrant, was torn and dusty. Her head was bowed, but as he stopped a few feet away, she slowly lifted her face. And he froze. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Not just the symmetry of her features, the high cheekbones, the delicate jawline, the straight line of her nose. It was the raw, untamed beauty that shone from her, even in this state. Her eyes, dark and deep like a desert night, were wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. There was a cut above her brow, dried blood streaking her temple. Pinned to the tree just above her head was a rough piece of wood with words burned into it. He squinted, the light failing. Only the pure deserve to live. A cold knot formed in his stomach. This wasn't banditry or simple cruelty. This was something darker, uglier. A judgment, a declaration of hate. He lowered his rifle slightly. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She flinched, her eyes darting to him, assessing. The defiance remained, but the fear was palpable. She didn't speak, her mouth dry and cracked. He took another step closer. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She watched him, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. He could see the raw rope burns on her wrists. How long had she been here? The sign. Only the pure. Who deemed themselves judge and jury out here? White settlers? Religious fanatics? He'd heard whispers in town, ugly sentiments about the savages, but nothing like this. He reached for his knife, sheathing his rifle. "I'm gonna cut you loose." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Relief? Suspicion? He couldn't tell. He moved behind her, carefully avoiding contact, his hands finding the rough ropes. They were tied tight, clearly meant to hold. As he sawed at the binds, he noticed how thin her wrists were, the skin chafed and raw. The ropes parted with a final snap. Her arms fell, and she stumbled forward, collapsing to her knees at the base of the tree, gasping, clutching her raw wrists. He knelt beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "You all right?" He knew it was a foolish question. Of course, she wasn't all right. She nodded slowly, her dark hair falling around her face, shielding it. She didn't look at him. He felt a strange pull, a reluctant instinct to offer aid. It went against the walls he had built, the isolation he had cultivated. But leaving her here was unthinkable. Tied to a tree with a message of hate nailed above her head. "Can you walk?" he asked. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing, testing her legs. She swayed slightly, clutching the tree trunk for support. She was unsteady, weak. "Come on," he said, standing up. "My cabin's not far. You need water, food, somewhere safe." She hesitated, her gaze finally meeting his, those dark, assessing eyes. He saw the question in them, the inherent mistrust of a stranger, especially a white man, out in this desolate place. He met her gaze steadily, trying to convey sincerity, absence of threat. "It's getting cold," he added, nodding towards the darkening sky and the wind that clawed at them both. She looked from him to the horizon, then back to the tree, the hateful sign a stark silhouette against the fading light. Whatever her predicament, whatever made her an outcast, this place was death. Slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. He retrieved his rifle, scanning the surroundings once more. Nothing moved but the trees and the tall grass bending in the wind. He motioned for her to follow, keeping a few paces ahead, his senses on high alert. She walked with a visible effort, limping slightly. He slowed his pace to match hers, glancing back occasionally to make sure she was still there. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken questions and deep-seated wariness. Who was she? What had she done, or what did they think she had done, to warrant such a cruel judgment? And who were they? The sign hinted at a group, not just a lone madman. A chilling thought settled over him. They might come looking for her. They reached his cabin as the last light bled from the sky. He opened the door and stepped aside. She hesitated on the threshold, looking into the dim, Spartan interior. It wasn't welcoming, but it was shelter. After a moment, she stepped inside. He closed the door, barring it more firmly than usual. The small space felt suddenly crowded, charged with her presence, her vulnerability. He moved to the stove, rekindling the low fire. "Sit down," he said, indicating the single chair at the table. She remained standing near the door, her eyes scanning the cabin, missing nothing. He poured water into a tin cup from the bucket he kept by the stove and offered it to her. Her hand trembled as she took it, but her grip was surprisingly strong. She drank slowly, deliberately, her throat working. He watched her, observing. She was young, maybe early 20s. Her hair, once unbound, was long and thick. Her features were fine, though smudged with dirt and dried blood. There was a stillness about her, a composure that belied her ordeal, broken only by the slight tremor in her hands and the tension held in her shoulders. After she finished the water, she handed the cup back. "Ahihi," she said softly. He blinked. "Navajo. Thank you." He hadn't expected her to speak English, or any English at all, He nodded, taking the cup. "You're welcome." Silence descended again. He busied himself preparing a simple meal, heating beans in a pot, slicing some dried jerky. He set a plate on the table, motioning for her again to sit. This time she complied, moving stiffly. She ate slowly, carefully, her eyes never leaving the plate or occasionally flicking up to him. She still seemed guarded, assessing. He ate his own meal, sitting across from her, the table small enough that their knees almost touched. He felt awkward, unsure of what to say or do. He was used to solitude, to the absence of another's presence. This intrusion, however necessary, felt jarring, disruptive, and yet the cabin didn't feel quite as empty. When they finished, he cleared the dishes. "You can sleep on the cot," he said, gesturing to the narrow bed against the wall. "I'll take the floor." She looked at the cot, then at him, more unspoken questions in her eyes. Was he safe? What did he expect in return? The world she clearly came from, and the world he knew on the frontier, weren't kind to women alone or women of her heritage. I won't harm you," he said, feeling clumsy and inadequate. "You're safe here." She held his gaze for a long moment. He saw a flicker of uncertainty, then perhaps a sliver of exhausted trust. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. She rose and went to the cot, sitting on the edge, her movements stiff. He laid out his bedroll near the door, keeping his rifle close. As he settled in, he watched her. She lay down fully clothed, facing the wall, her body tense. He doused the lamp, leaving the cabin in near darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers in the stove. The wind still rattled the walls. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the wind, sent a jolt of awareness through him. He listened to her breathing, shallow and uneven at first, eventually deepening into the rhythm of sleep. He lay there, thinking about the sign, about the cruelty, about the dark eyes that held both fear and fire. He didn't know anything about her, her name, where she came from, why she was targeted, but he knew he couldn't have left her. And now she was here, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, a disruption to his carefully constructed isolation. The next morning was colder. He woke before she did, rekindled the fire, and made coffee. She stirred as he moved about, sitting up slowly, watching him with that same quiet intensity. "Morning," he said simply. She nodded in return, her eyes still wary. She pushed herself off the cot, moving more easily than she had the night before, though she still favored one leg. He noticed her ankle was swollen. "Looks like you twisted it," he said, indicating her ankle. "I've got some liniment, might help." She looked hesitant. He went to a small shelf and retrieved a jar, setting it on the table. "It's just for aches and bruises," he explained. She studied the jar, then him. After a moment, she sat down at the table, pulling up the hem of her dress slightly, exposing the swollen, discolored ankle. He knelt awkwardly before her, uncapping the jar. The smell of menthol filled the air. He dipped his fingers in and gently began to rub the liniment into her skin. He tried to be careful, his rough hands moving with unexpected tenderness. Her skin was smooth beneath his touch. He felt her flinch slightly at first, but she didn't pull away. He focused on the task, trying to ignore the sudden, unfamiliar awareness of her presence, the warmth of her skin under his fingers. It had been so long since he had touched anyone, felt the living warmth of another human being. It stirred something deep within him, something he had thought was dead. When he finished, he capped the jar and stood up, feeling a flush creep up his neck. "That might help," he mumbled. "You should stay off it as much as you can." She nodded again, pulling her dress back down. "Ahehe," she murmured. He made breakfast, simple as ever. Biscuits and gravy. She ate slowly, watching him as he moved around the small cabin. He felt her eyes on him constantly, observing his every move, assessing him. He tried to ignore it, to go about his routine as if she weren't there, but it was impossible. They spent the next few days in a strained silence. She stayed in the cabin, resting her ankle. He worked outside, always within sight of the cabin, his rifle never far. He found himself scanning the horizon more often, listening for sounds other than the wind. He knew they might come. The men who would tie a woman to a tree and leave her to die with a hateful message. He learned small things about her through observation. She was meticulous, tidying the small cabin when he was outside, folding her blanket neatly on the cot. She watched him work, sometimes through the window, her gaze thoughtful. She seemed to understand his movements, the rhythm of his tasks. There was a quiet strength about her, even in her vulnerability. He still didn't know her name. He hesitated to ask, not wanting to push. He would leave food for her when he went out for the day, and she would eat it. He would leave water, and she would drink it. Small, necessary exchanges that chipped away at the wall of silence between them. One evening, as he cleaned his rifle by the fire, she spoke. "They call me Nahili," she said, her voice soft but clear. He paused, looking up at her. "Nahili." He repeated the name. It sounded like a gentle breeze or running water. "I'm Thomas." "Thomas." She said his name slowly, tasting it. Why were you tied to the tree, Nahili?" he asked, finally daring to breach the subject. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the fire. A long silence stretched between them. He didn't press. Finally she spoke, her voice low, hesitant. "They did not like that I spoke my mind, that I asked questions. They said I was contaminated by white ways, by bad thoughts." "Who are they?" "Men from my village, some others, who think they know what is right, what is pure." She hugged her knees to her chest. "It is not just my village, it is in many places now. Fear, anger, against those who are different, those who do not fit their idea." He thought of the sign, "Only the pure deserve to live." It wasn't just about her heritage, perhaps, it was about conformity, about control. And she was a woman who spoke her mind, who asked questions. That was enough to make her impure in their eyes. The casual cruelty of it made his stomach clench. "And you were outcast?" he asked gently. She nodded. "They had stones, and words. They drove me out. I was trying to reach my aunt. She lives far away." "And they caught you?" "Yes, 3 of them. They found me near the canyon." Her voice was low, haunted. They said they were purifying the land, ridding it of infection." Infection. The word sent a shiver down his spine. He looked at her. This woman deemed an infection by her own people, abandoned and condemned to die by strangers who felt entitled to judge. It echoed his own feeling of being discarded, though his circumstances were different. He had been cast out by grief, by the inability of others to look past his loss. She had been cast out by fear and hate. "I'm sorry, Nahili," he said, the words feeling insufficient. She looked at him then, her dark eyes searching his face. "You cut me down," she said. "You brought me here. You gave me food, shelter." "Anyone would have," he mumbled, feeling a strange embarrassment. "No," she said softly. "Not anyone. Many would have left me, or worse." He knew she was right. The frontier was a harsh place, and prejudice was a common currency. His own neighbors, decent enough folks in their own way, often spoke of the Navajo with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Over the next week, a fragile understanding began to grow between them. Her ankle slowly healed, though she still favored it. She helped with small tasks around the cabin, sweeping the dirt floor, organizing the meager supplies. She didn't speak much, but her silence was no longer tense or suspicious. It was comfortable, shared. They learned each other's rhythms. He learned she liked her coffee strong and black. She learned he preferred working in the quiet of the morning. They communicated mostly through gestures, simple words, and observation. He found himself watching her, fascinated by the quiet grace of her movements, the way her eyes held a depth of ancient knowledge and enduring spirit. He told her, haltingly, about his life, about his wife, about the fever, about why he came to this lonely place. He hadn't spoken of it to anyone since he left town. The words were difficult, scraped from a place of deep pain, but saying them to her, someone who also carried unseen burdens, felt surprisingly easing. She listened without interruption, her gaze steady and compassionate. When he finished, she simply nodded, her eyes conveying understanding. "Loss leaves a hole," she said quietly. "It does not ever truly fill, but life can grow around it, like grass around a stone." Her simple wisdom struck him. He had been so focused on the hole, he hadn't considered the possibility of life growing around it. He looked at her, this woman who had lost her home, her community, faced death, and yet spoke of growth. He started teaching her simple English words, pointing to objects: fire, water, sky, horse. She picked them up quickly, her mind sharp. In turn, she taught him some Navajo words: Niutsa, wind; To, water; Ziu, mountain. The shared language, however basic, was a bridge, a way to connect on a deeper level than mere necessity. He noticed himself changing. The cabin didn't feel quite so empty. The silence was no longer a heavy weight, but a quiet space shared between two people. He found himself smiling sometimes, a genuine smile, something he hadn't done in years. He worried about her, a protective instinct rising in him that was fierce and unfamiliar. It was more than just the duty he felt when he found her. It was a growing care for her, for Nahili. One afternoon, he was splitting wood, the rhythmic swing of the axe a familiar comfort. She came out and sat on the cabin steps, watching him. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "You work hard," she said, her English still halting but clear. "Gotta," he shrugged. "Land doesn't give anything for free." She nodded, her gaze sweeping across the harsh landscape. "It is a hard land, but strong, like you." The simple compliment landed unexpectedly, warming him more than the fire. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just a vulnerable woman he had rescued, but a person of resilience, strength, and quiet beauty. He saw the way she carried herself, the calm in her eyes despite everything. Their connection deepened, forged in shared vulnerability and quiet understanding. He knew the risk of keeping her. If those men came looking, his isolation wouldn't protect him. They would see him as a sympathizer, maybe worse. But the thought of turning her away, of sending her back out into a world that had already condemned her, was unbearable. Then came the storm. It rolled in fast, a furious wall of gray and white that swallowed the horizon. The wind shrieked, higher pitched and more violent than usual, tearing at the cabin walls, threatening to rip the roof off. Snow began to fall, thick and fast, blinding. They huddled inside, the fire roaring in the stove, but doing little against the bone-deep chill that permeated the air. The storm was a physical manifestation of the harshness of their world, the arbitrary cruelty it could unleash. They sat side by the stove, closer than they had ever sat before. He felt the warmth radiating from her, a small comfort against the raging elements outside. As the storm intensified, a crash made them both jump. Something had hit the side of the cabin, then another, and another, not the wind, not ice. Stones. Thomas went to the small, iced-over window, peering out. Through the swirling snow, he saw dark shapes moving. Men on horseback, cloaked against the weather. They had found her. His heart hammered, a cold dread seizing him. The sign, "Only the pure deserve to live." These were the men who wrote it. He turned back to Nahili, his face grim. "They're here." Her eyes widened, fear flooding them, raw and undisguised. But then, a flicker of something else. Resignation? Determination? More stones hammered against the cabin. A voice, muffled by the wind, shouted something unintelligible. "They want me," Nahili said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know." He picked up his rifle, checking the action. It felt heavy, solid, familiar in his hands. He had faced down wolves and mountain lions, but never men like these. Men filled with such righteous, hateful certainty. "You don't have to," she said, looking at him earnestly. "You can tell them. You found me here. Tell them you didn't know. Maybe they will leave you be." He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, the vulnerability she tried to hide. He thought of the rope burns on her wrists, the sign nailed to the tree. He thought of the quiet nights in the cabin, the shared silence that had started to feel like peace, the fragile bridge they had built between their two worlds. "No," he said, his voice firm, surprising himself with its conviction. "I won't." He went to the door, placing a hand on the heavy wooden bar. The shouting outside grew louder, more distinct now, carried on a sudden lull in the wind. Ugly words, slurs, demands. Demands for the Navajo whore, the impure woman. He felt a surge of cold fury. His grief had made him run, hide, build walls, but those walls were meant to protect his emptiness. Now, faced with this, with their hate aimed at someone he had come to care for, something within him snapped. His isolation wasn't a sanctuary, it was just a cage he had built. And they were trying to break into it, not to offer him solace, but to take something precious away. He unbarred the door. Nahili cried out his name, a sharp, frightened sound. He pushed the door open just enough to step out onto the small porch, the wind immediately tearing at his clothes, the snow stinging his face. The figures on horseback were closer now, indistinct shapes in the blizzard, but he could make out the glint of steel. There were 5 of them. "Get out," he yelled, his voice swallowed by the wind and snow but carrying his intent. One of the riders spurred his horse closer, stopping about 50 feet away. He was a big man, heavily bundled, his face mostly obscured by a scarf. "We know you got her, Benton," he shouted back, his voice rough. "Hand over the Injun woman." "She's not hurting anyone," Thomas yelled, gripping his rifle. "She's an abomination," another voice screeched from the group. "An impurity on this land." The sign was clear. "I don't care about your damn sign," Thomas shouted, raising his rifle slightly. "Get off my land." The leader laughed, a harsh, ugly sound in the storm. "Your land? You think you own the purity of the Lord's earth, Benton? She's coming with us." "No, she's not." Thomas felt strangely calm now, the fear replaced by a cold, resolute anger. He wouldn't let them take her. Not after everything. Not after he had found her, had brought her back to life, however tentatively. The leader dismounted, drawing a pistol. The others stayed on their horses, spreading out slightly. "Last chance, Benton. Step aside, or get purified yourself." "Go to hell," Thomas said, aiming his rifle. The leader fired. The shot cracked through the storm, loud and jarring. Thomas felt a searing pain in his side and stumbled back, but he squeezed his own trigger in return. His rifle roared, the recoil jarring his shoulder. He saw the leader stagger back, clutching his arm. Chaos erupted. The other riders started firing, their shots kicking up snow and splintering the porch railing. Thomas ducked back inside the cabin, slamming the door shut. "Thomas." Nahili was by his side instantly, her face pale with fear. She saw the blood staining his side. "You are hurt." "It's all right," he gritted out, pressing a hand to the wound. It was shallow, painful, but not deep. He needed to think. He couldn't fight 5 armed men in an open shootout, not wounded, not with her inside. The cabin was sturdy, but it wouldn't hold up forever against sustained gunfire. They needed a plan. "Back way," he said, pointing towards the rear wall. There was a small, rough-cut opening, barely big enough for a window, used for ventilation in the summer. "Outside? In the storm?" Nahili questioned, her eyes wide. "It's the only way," he insisted. "They'll expect us to stay put. We go out the back, maybe we can circle around, get away." Gunfire hammered against the front of the cabin, wood splintered. They didn't have much time. "Go," he urged, pushing her towards the opening. She hesitated for only a second, then scrambled through the narrow gap. Thomas followed, wincing as the movement aggravated his wound. They dropped into the deep snowdrifts on the other side of the cabin. The wind was even fiercer here, swirling the snow into a whiteout. Visibility was almost zero. It was brutal, but it was also their cover. "Stay low," Thomas shouted over the wind, pulling Nahili along. He knew the terrain around his cabin intimately. There was a small copse of pine trees a little ways off, offering some shelter. They moved fast, stumbling through the drifts, the snow soaking their clothes. The sound of gunfire from the cabin faded slightly, muffled by the storm. They were still focused on the front. They reached the pines, huddling together against the wind. Thomas was breathing hard, the cold air burning his lungs, the pain in his side a dull throb. Nahili was shivering, her teeth chattering. "Which way?" she whispered, looking at him. "South," he said, pointing. "Towards the canyon. There's a cave I know. It's hidden. Can wait out the storm there." It was a risk. The canyon was rough country. But it was the opposite direction from the likely approach of the men, and the storm made tracking them nearly impossible. They set off again, pushing through the blizzard. It was a brutal trek. The wind clawed at them, the snow clung to them like a shroud. Thomas, weakened by his wound and the cold, found himself leaning on Nahili occasionally. She, despite her injured ankle and the ordeal she had already suffered, moved with surprising strength and resilience. She knew the land, knew how to navigate by instinct even in the white chaos. They reached the rim of the canyon, a dizzying drop hidden by the swirling snow. Thomas knew the path down, a narrow, winding trail only he used. Finding the cave in this weather would be hard, but they had to try. "Careful," he warned, leading the way down the slippery, snow-covered path. The descent was treacherous: loose rock, hidden ice, the blinding snow. At one point, Thomas slipped, cried out as the pain in his side flared, and would have fallen if Nahili hadn't grabbed his arm, her small hand surprisingly strong. "You all right?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. "Yeah," he gasped, righting himself. "Just watch your step." She kept a firm grip on his arm as they continued down, her presence a steady anchor in the disorienting storm. He was supposed to be protecting her, but in this moment, she was helping him just as much. They finally reached the bottom of the canyon. The wind was less fierce here, sheltered by the high walls, but the snow was still falling heavily. They searched for what felt like an eternity, shivering, exhausted, the cold seeping into their bones. Just as despair threatened to set in, Nahili spotted it, a faint trail of smoke, nearly invisible in the storm, rising from a fissure in the rock face. "There," she pointed, her voice hoarse. Thomas saw it. The cave. He had used it a few times when caught out in bad weather. It was little more than a deep overhang, but it offered shelter and, crucially, a natural chimney that allowed for a small, smokeless fire. They stumbled towards it, pushing aside the snowdrifts piled up at the entrance. Inside, it was blessedly still, the roar of the storm muted to a distant rumble. The air was cold, damp, but it was refuge. Thomas knelt, fumbling with frozen fingers for the tinder and flint he always carried. He managed to get a small fire going in the designated spot, feeding it with dry wood stored in the back of the cave. The heat was a lifeline, a physical comfort after the brutal cold. They huddled close to the fire, wrapped in the thin blankets he had managed to grab from the cabin. The silence in the cave was profound after the chaos outside. They listened to the storm rage, the sound, a distant roar that no longer felt immediate. Nahili looked at his side, where the blood had soaked through his shirt and was starting to freeze. "Your wound," she said, her brow furrowed with worry. "It's not bad," he lied, though the pain was considerable. She didn't argue. She reached out a hand, gently touching the stained fabric. "We need to clean it." He nodded. He had a small first aid kit in his pack. He fumbled it open, pulling out bandages and antiseptic. With the firelight casting dancing shadows, Nahili carefully helped him remove his coat and shirt. The wound was an ugly red gash, bleeding sluggishly. She cleaned it with water he heated over the fire, her touch gentle but firm. He gritted his teeth against the sting of the antiseptic. She worked with a quiet focus, her fingers surprisingly skilled. It occurred to him that she likely knew traditional healing practices. When she finished bandaging it, she looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a depth of emotion he couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude? Concern? Something more? "Why?" she asked softly, echoing the question he had asked himself moments before unbarring the door. "Why did you help me? Why did you fight them?" He looked into the fire, watching the flames lick the dry wood. The walls he had built felt suddenly fragile, crumbling around them in the face of the storm, the violence, and this quiet, shared moment in the cave. I couldn't leave you," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "Not like that, not for that." He turned to face her fully. "That sign. Only the pure deserve to live. That's not right, Nahili. No one gets to decide that about another person." He paused, searching for the words, the truth he was only just starting to understand himself. "I lived out here alone because I thought I deserved to be alone, because I'd lost everything, because the world felt empty. But you showed me that the world isn't empty, that there's still life, and courage, and beauty." He reached out hesitantly and took her hand. Her skin was cool, but her grip was warm and steady. "You are not impure, Nahili. You are strong and good." Tears welled up in her dark eyes, glistening in the firelight. She didn't speak, but she squeezed his hand. In that small, enclosed space, with the storm raging outside, surrounded by the harsh reality of their world, they found a quiet, profound connection. Two outcasts, one by grief, one by hate, finding refuge and understanding in each other. They spent the night in the cave, the storm a distant symphony of wind and snow. They talked in hushed tones, sharing more pieces of their lives, their fears, their hopes. He learned about her life in the village, her family, the growing division that had led to her being cast out. She learned more about his life before the fever, his dreams, the man he had been before grief hollowed him out. When dawn finally broke, the storm had subsided. The world outside the cave was transformed, covered in a thick blanket of pristine white snow. The sky was a clear, sharp blue. It was beautiful, but also exposed. They knew they couldn't go back to the cabin, not yet. Those men would be back, or they would wait. Their best chance was to wait, let the snow cover their tracks, then try to make their way south, towards the territory Nahili hoped her aunt lived in. They emerged from the cave, blinking in the bright light reflected off the snow. The canyon was silent, peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. Thomas's side ached, but the bleeding had stopped. Nahili's ankle was still swollen, but she could walk on it, carefully. They started moving, slowly and deliberately, making their way through the deep snow, following the route Nahili remembered from her initial journey before being captured. Thomas kept his rifle ready, scanning the horizon, his senses on high alert. They walked for 2 days, rationed food and water stretched thin. It was grueling, exhausting work. They faced the bitter cold, the difficult terrain, the constant unspoken fear of being followed. But they faced it together. They shared the burden, helping each other over difficult patches, sharing the last of their food, sharing the silence that was no longer empty but companionable. They talked about what they would do: reach her aunt, find a place where they could be safe. The future was uncertain, a vast, snowy landscape of unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, Thomas didn't feel entirely alone facing it. He had Nahili, and she, he hoped, had him. They stumbled upon a small, hidden spring, miraculously unfrozen, its water clear and cold. They drank deeply, washing away some of the grime and exhaustion of the past few days. As they rested by the spring, Nahili looked at him, her expression soft. "You saved me, Thomas," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "You helped save me too, Nahili," he admitted. "From myself. From the dark." He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. Her skin was soft, cool. He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, hesitant touch of lips that spoke of unspoken gratitude, shared hardship, and the fragile, unexpected dawn of something new. She kissed him back, a soft, yielding pressure that sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire in the cave. It was a kiss born of survival and desperation, yes, but also of respect, understanding, and a deep, quiet connection forged in the crucible of shared danger and vulnerability. In that moment, under the vast, clear sky, surrounded by the silent, snowy wilderness, they were not a grieving widower and a Navajo outcast. They were just Thomas and Nahili, two people who had found each other against all odds, clinging to a fragile hope in a world that had tried its best to break them. They knew the journey wasn't over. The men who had hunted Nahili were still out there. Finding her aunt, finding a safe place, would be difficult. But as they stood there by the spring, hand in hand, looking out at the immense, unforgiving landscape, it didn't seem quite as daunting. They weren't pure, not in the twisted sense of the men who judged them. They were flawed, scarred survivors, but together they were strong. And in the vast, lonely world, they had found something precious: belonging. The journey towards healing had begun, not in forgetting the past, but in building a future together, step by careful step, across the wide, white prairie. Resilience, born from loss, found strength in unexpected connection, challenging the harsh judgments of the world with the quiet power of acceptance and understanding.